So it is understandable for these Israeli soldiers to weep and cry because they've invested so much in this genocide, and ultimately they've been forced to pull out. That doesn't mean the war is over, because it is quite possible that the ceasefire will collapse. We have to see what Netanyahu does. We'll have to see where Trump takes this. But if the ceasefire moves forward, it is a catastrophic defeat for the regime. And if they continue with the genocide, I think the defeat will be even more catastrophic, because the world is now uh, witnessing these soldiers being released. The images are very bad for Israel. Seeing these women soldiers well fed, these all of the Israelis well fed, well taken care of. It again rips apart the narrative of the West and the Israeli regime, Western media, Western governments, Western think tanks, Western journalists. Their narrative has been ripped apart, and then of course they don't show the thousands of Palestinians who are being released, the women and the children, many of them who were uh, just taken hostage and never charged. But we see how many of them were battered, how many of them have broken teeth, and many of them are suffering from malnutrition. This has been catastrophic for the regime. And if the genocide resumes, I think the world will be much more angry than even it has been over the past few months. And I think that more people will sadly die because of the Western insistence to impose racism on the people of our region. The West insists on supporting ethno-supremacism. They insist on ethnic cleansing, and they insist on genocide and slaughter. That's what Western regimes have been doing in Palestine for a very long time, and they've intensified it more recently. But this will not end well for them. I think this is the beginning of the end of the Israeli regime. I think that significant numbers will, a significant number has already left, and more will leave in future, because the regime will no longer it will no longer thrive. No major business would be stupid enough to invest in Palestine anymore, because they know that if something happens, all of those investments can just disappear. And therefore, I I don't see this lasting much longer. I'm not saying that the regime will collapse next month or next year, but I think we are witnessing the beginning of the end. And as you point out, history is not a matter of days and weeks. Things can play out very slowly, but for us at least. But for a historian who looks back in history, these are very brief moments. But in any case, I'm confident that ultimately apartheid in Palestine will be defeated, and we already see that there has been a sea change across the world. Most people across the world seem to be ignorant about Palestine. They just saw Israel as a country, and the Palestinian issue as a small conflict between two people over land. Over the past 15, 16 months, people have been learning about history. They've learned about the Nikba. They've been seeing the nature of Zionism, what Zionism actually means, and the racism and the evil that lies behind it. And even in the United States, you've seen, as I said earlier, a sea change among public opinion and and people of influence. So it gave large numbers of martyrs among civilians and among supporters of the resistance and among the resistance itself, for the sake of another people, for the sake of the people of Palestine, for the people of Gaza in particular. And in addition to that, Ansar Allah, they did the same. They made sacrifices. They were constantly being bombed by the Americans and their sidekick in London, and also the Israelis, because they were implementing the Genocide Convention in the Red Sea, blocking ships from going to Israeli ports. And this is the same Ansarullah that survived 7 years of genocide itself, a genocide where the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the support of Qatar, with the support of Turkey, all of these countries were supporting the genocide in in Yemen, along with NATO countries. They were all behind. Ansarullah was very much alone. Only later on, when there was a split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and we saw that the Saudis and the Emiratis besiege Qatar, Turkey and Qatar move away from Saudi Arabia. But so Yemen, which had survived 7 years of genocide, they were willing to make even more sacrifices for the sake of the people of Gaza. So he gave them special thanks alongside the resistance in Iraq and, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But he also thanked Jordanian citizens who went into, on their own, at their own initiative, not the government had nothing to do with it, into the West Bank and carried out operations against the Israeli regime, and they were all killed and they were all martyred fighting. There were, I think, 2 or 3 attacks, if I'm not mistaken. Your viewers could correct me if I'm wrong. So if there is a revival, there's no doubt that as we speak, the Iranians continue to support Gaza. They will get new supplies. It's been going on throughout this period through the means that they have, which I have no idea how it works. And the same is happening in Lebanon. The same is happening in Yemen. They're all preparing themselves for the next phase. But it's going to be very costly for the regime if it revives this war. Again, the biggest, as I said, all the areas that they've withdrawn from in Gaza, the resistance is preparing those territories for the future. So if they want to fight again, they'll have to retake all those territories. And but alongside that, the international community is going to be disgusted because they're saying, well, this is over now. Why are you seeking further trouble? They're releasing your prisoners. And it was very interesting, very smart move by the resistance to have these women, most of these women, wear their uniforms to remind the world that these weren't just a bunch of teenagers or young women that were taken. These were soldiers of the Israeli armed forces. The people of Gaza and the resistance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the others, they were fighting for their survival. But Hezbollah willingly sacrificed their members, their soldiers, their leaders to protect the people of Gaza, to draw away much of the Israeli regime forces. And in fact, during the 2 months of very heavy fighting between the regime and Hezbollah, that fighting, as I said earlier, was the most intense, not of just this war, but of all the wars that the regime has fought in its history. And Hezbollah held its ground. Israel right now is much more vulnerable than before. And as I said, the world is sick and tired of this genocide. Everyone's people are disgusted, but to restart this genocide after this defeat is going to be much more difficult. And also, since they've withdrawn from Gaza, or most of Gaza right now, it's going to be they're going to go and have to fight. They're going to have to fight again to retake those territories. And in Lebanon, although they never really made any inroads, what they did was that after the ceasefire, they started taking territory. That's how untrustworthy this regime is. So they would go into towns and villages that they'd never been able to take during the war, and they would go in there and start burning down people's homes and the mosques and the shops, and they've been destroying village after village alongside the border. That's how despicable these people are. But people have, as I said, over the last few days, they've used people power, and they've pushed them out of most of these territories. If the regime initiates another conflict, it's not going to go well for it. It's going to be much worse than before. And I don't think that it's going to look good for Trump, because Trump was showing this as a sign of his success, in that he was able to bring about a ceasefire before he came into office. And even though he's said the ceasefire may not hold, but it won't look good for him if his allies and if his genocidal allies in Tel Aviv initiated something where the world would see as just another excuse to bring about further genocide. And if the regime does to end the ceasefire and begin the genocide again, it's going to be much more difficult because Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah have been preparing themselves. They've also had a huge morale boost because people in Gaza have come and seen their power, their capabilities. The world has seen the narrative of the Israeli regime collapse, and Yemen is prepared to fire more missiles. And remember, Iran will ultimately punish if the fighting goes on. Iran will retaliate against the Israeli regime at some point. There's no doubt about that. I know some people have been saying, why hasn't Iran struck the regime? But as I said before, there were two elements. One was the fact that when Syria fell, and since Syrian airspace became more easily accessible to the Israeli regime, the Iranians had to recalculate how to set up air defenses to make sure the country is protected. And then we had the secret negotiations that were beginning in order to revive the ceasefire after Trump's victory. And the Iranians did not want that to be sabotaged. So during the, I think, 40 days roughly of negotiations, which Iran was deeply involved with because Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Ansarullah, they're in constant communication with one another. During that period, Iran was cautious not to allow the Israeli regime to have an excuse to refrain from establishing a ceasefire. And without a doubt, the Israelis would like to see a war. They would be more than willing to sacrifice the United States or the Europeans or the global economy for their own selfish interests. They never cared about the West. They've destroyed the image and the credibility of the West by carrying out this Holocaust for the last 15, 16 months. The West has paid the price in the sense that they have no credibility across the world. The world sees the West as barbaric and inhumane, the Western elites and the regimes that are in power. So Israel, is more than willing to sacrifice everything. The only thing that was unexpected was Syria. And Syria, as I said from the very beginning, was a tactical victory for Netanyahu, Erdogan, and Biden. But I think in the long run, actually, Syria is not going to end well for any of these actors because Al-Qaeda in Syria is not going to be able to control the country. We're already seeing it's the slaughter of people who they feel are a threat. We see that they're incapable of governing, and we also see that countries across the region and across Asia are wary, very wary of Al-Qaeda. Countries that like China, Russia, Central Asian countries where many of these fighters come from, they're concerned, and they're concerned about what Mr. Erdogan is doing. And even countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan are concerned. Jolani is trying to strengthen relations with the Saudis, but the Saudis are worried because these extremists in Syria have ambitions that go beyond the borders of Syria, and many of them are far more extreme than Jolani, or at least Jolani today. Otherwise, Jolani was the deputy of ISIS. He was Abu Baghdadi's deputy. He killed thousands of people in car bombs across Iraq. But the Jolani today, he is going to have a very tough time dealing with the more extreme elements that have taken Damascus. And that, as I said, is a threat to the West because the countries that are threatened by these extremist groups are in the Western camp. But this time around in Gaza, they were stuck. And in Lebanon, we saw the most heavy fighting ever between the Israeli regime and the power outside of its borders. The battle in southern Lebanon on the border was very heavy. The fighting was extraordinarily heavy, but Hezbollah held its ground, and the Israeli regime was unable to take a single city, even a small city or a large town. It failed completely. And while many were martyred in Gaza and in Lebanon, and civilians were slaughtered, and resistance fighters on both to the south and the north were martyred, but the Israelis failed. And we also saw in the Red Sea for over 15 months, the Americans tried to crush the resistance there too, so that the Israelis could use the Red Sea to strengthen their economy, to carry out the genocide more easily. They failed. They failed across the board. This was all expected. I've been saying that the Israeli regime will fail in Gaza and in Lebanon and in the Red Sea from the very beginning. The Israelis were bound to be defeated in Gaza, despite the horrific massacres and the genocide, the Holocaust. The Palestinians were determined from day one that they will hold their ground. And Hamas and its allies showed the Israelis that they are not the power that they were before. In the decades before the rise of the axis of resistance, whenever the Israelis wanted to invade a neighboring country, whether Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt, they would advance swiftly and take large amounts of land. They went all the way to Beirut, they took the West Bank, they took the Golan, and of course they went all the way across the Sinai very easily and very swiftly. So I think this has been a major defeat for Israel. The last 16 months, been almost 16 months now, have been disastrous. And the most important element of all is that the regime has been delegitimized in the eyes of the global majority. Even in the West, even in the United States, you see people like Tucker Carlson saying things that were not said before, or Candace Owens. These are people on the right, and among other groups in American civil society, we see huge opposition toward Zionism and the regime itself. And therefore, I think that that is the most devastating aspect of this conflict, the fact that they have not just the Israeli regime, but the collective West. It has destroyed its image across the world because they've been partner to this genocide. So I think Iran is in a position, it's being very smart. They have the capability, and that itself is deterrence. It's a threshold state. But they don't want the bomb. And as I said, if they wanted it, they would have had it a long time ago. And there's nothing that the Americans could have done about it. And there's nothing they can do about it today. And that, I think, the smartest thing is to do one's best to prevent nuclear war, because that would bring about the end of humanity. If there's a nuclear exchange anywhere in this world, that will have huge consequences. And of course, if it's between the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians, that would bring an end to everything. But a nuclear war, whether between India and Pakistan or or in our region, that will have consequences for the entire globe that will be irreversible. I find it very strange that some people say that Iran is using the axis of resistance in order to strike a deal with the Americans. Well, if Iran didn't have the axis, if Iran didn't support the axis of resistance in the first place, if it did not create the axis of resistance in the first place, it wouldn't have a problem with the United States to have the need for some sort of deal today. Iran has been living with maximum pressure sanctions for 15 years now, or even more. And we've had sanctions since the beginning of the revolution. So since the beginning of the revolution, we had sanctions, and they just increased year after year. And Iran has been supporting these groups, funding these groups, so they paid a heavy price for the axis of. So that's nonsense. And these claims made against Iran are usually made by people who do nothing for the resistance themselves. At most, they fire off a few tweets, but they don't do anything. They don't force their governments to change their stance. All the governments in the region, or at least most of them, are collaborating with the Israelis. Turkey, the Turkish government is doing business as usual, sending oil from Baku. Baku has just signed a deal with the Israeli regime to buy 10% of a an investment in a gas field in the Mediterranean. Egypt is doing business with the Israelis, so is Jordan, so is the Emirates.